Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, I'm Sarthak and I welcome you all to All Things Policy. In today's episode, we are going to discuss the status of women's employment in factories. The lack of participation of women in the labor force has been a concern in India, and it is impacted by a host of factors. Some of these we have discussed in previous episodes. In this episode, we are going to touch a different but related aspect. We are going to talk about legal factors, the different kinds of laws, rules that might have a bearing on women's employment in factories. To discuss this, I have with me my colleague Suman. We have recorded multiple episodes before, and we have two guests. Ms. Anu, who is a research associate at Center for Public Policy Research, Kochi. April, who is an associate strategic communications and program management at CPPR Kochi. They recently wrote a policy brief analyzing the Kerala draft occupational safety, health, and working condition code and the draft rules. We'll share the link of the paper along with the podcast. We strongly recommend you to go through it. Hi Suman, hi Anu, hi April.
Hello.
Welcome to All Things Policy.
Thanks, Sarthak. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Before we go into the analysis of Kerala's law, we just want to understand the context, right? You have analyzed policies which are going to impact employment of women in factories, right? So before we dive into that specific policy analysis, I just want to understand what is the current status of women employment in factories in Kerala. If you can share some insight, some data, it will be great.
Sure, Sarthak. So, like what you said, the study was to understand the legal barriers that affect women employment in factories, specifically in Kerala. But to give a context, as we all know, the latest periodic labor force survey, it says that the female labor force participation at the national level is hardly 25.1%, to be very specific. So if you look at the Kerala statistics of female labor force participation rate, I would say it's a little better than the national average. It's about 29% in 2022. But again, if you look a little deeper into it, when you look at the three sectors of the economy, the manufacturing sector actually contribute very less towards this. Especially in Kerala, it's hardly 12% of women is working in the factories or the manufacturing sector, the secondary sector. So we were just trying to analyze why there is a lack of participation, why there is a low participation in the manufacturing sector. So this actually led to the understanding that there are certain provisions in the Factories Act of 1948 as well as the subsequent Kerala Factories Rules of 1957 and also the labor codes which actually came in later. So there are certain legal provisions that is affecting women from entering the workforce. So that was the whole idea of the study. And also, I think even the gender gap index, which is brought out by the World Economic Forum, we lack a lot in the economic participation. That is one of the indicators for assessing the gender gap index. I think we rank third from the last, that is 143rd out of 146. And we actually do a very bad performance with respect to other countries also. So all these factors actually gave us this idea of looking further into this issue. Since CPPR is based in Kerala, we thought we'll first deal with the state of Kerala to understand what is a problem. So eventually it led to the understanding that there is a night shift ban, as well as there are certain restrictions at the factories level where women are not allowed to work in certain dangerous factories as well. So which we can discuss in detail in further questions.
Yeah. So what I was coming at is that all these laws that are made, right, for say safety or women's supposedly for women's protection, etc., they come with good intentions in the sense that they want to ensure safe working spaces for women, which will make women more forthcoming or will encourage women to come into the workforce. But what you are saying, or what the paper actually says, is that the labor codes or the rules, that the draft rules, are actually hindering women from coming into the labor force. Is that a correct assessment?
Thank you for that question, Suman. So, this is the first thought we also had in mind. Okay, to give a context to this, the laws that go in, Central government had brought out the Factories Act 1948, and we also have the Kerala Factories Rules 1957. Since this factory comes under the concurrent list, every state has to bring out their own rules to implement that act. And as you know, since I said it's Factories Act 1948, it's after so many decades that they've actually brought out new labor codes that will, if it comes into enforcement, it will subsume all the labor laws that are currently there. So, the setting in which the previous laws were made, the intention was always to protect women. And after so many decades, they have tried to make the law a little more progressive. So we have these two main issues that we came across in the Factories Act. That is, one is relating to night shift restriction. That is, women are not allowed to be employed in factories after 7 p.m. until 6 a.m. in the morning. So this was in the previous Factories Act. Now, when the new labor code came out, that is the Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code, they removed that restriction, but with a lot of conditions that the employer has to fulfill if they want to implement that particular thing. The second restriction was on certain activities that women can get engaged in. Certain manufacturing activities are considered to be hazardous for women, and based on that, they also restricted women. So these are the major two problems that were there in the Factories Act and rules. Now, when we come to the new labor codes that are there, they've tried to be progressive in the sense that they try to remove the night shift restriction with certain conditions. They tried to make the labor code remove the restricted activities for women as well in the so called dangerous processes. Only pregnant women were restricted. But now, when it comes to Kerala's rules corresponding to these labor codes brought out by the government, they have continued with the restricted activities that were there in the factories rules of 1957. So, if they are still continuing,
Do many of these activities still exist now, or has technology replaced some of these things?
so in the current context, over these past decades, so many technological advancements have taken place. So many activities that are considered dangerous have been mechanized. The safety measures that are taken have also improved. So, considering these things, we don't see that reflected in the law that have been brought out even now, which is why we feel like they're still trying to protect women, but the setting during which the previous laws were brought out has changed. But the law hasn't changed as much as that.
Yeah. So, apart from that, any other top or key points that you would like to point out in the recent draft rules?
So, see, what exactly happened is this in the draft rules of Kerala, when you compare it with the earlier rules, that is 1957 rules, night shift ban has been taken. Like there was a night shift ban in the 1957 rules, which is taken out in the new rules. But there is a lot many mandate on the employers. For example, they have to provide accommodation, they have to provide transportation. There has to be a minimum number of women supervisors, a minimum number of women to get them employed in the night shift. So there are a lot many provisions. Like also they are bringing up post provisions like sexual harassment.
The provisions related to the night shifts and the dangerous activities. Can you just elaborate on that? What are some of the sub points within these provisions?
So, regarding night shift, what we understood is that when the new labor codes came into picture, the new labor codes actually are very progressive. Like April said, they actually allow women to work in night shifts. But the state governments, being like labor being in the concurrent list, the state governments, when they brought the rule, especially the Kerala government, when they brought the rules under the code, what happened is that they allow night shifts, but with lot many conditions on the employer. So when you look at from the perspective of an employer, if you are hiring a woman to work in the night shift, first you have to get the consent of the women. Second, you have to provide transportation, that is pick up and drop from her residence. Third, you will have to provide accommodation if necessary. Fourth, you will have to appoint extra women supervisors.
Okay.
If you only have male supervisors, you will have to employ women supervisors. Fourth, you will have to have minimum number of women in the factory for getting them employed during night. And six, you will have to enforce like sexual harassment provisions. There is a grievance day, especially for women. And also, you need to have women security personnel.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's when you think it's actually adding to the cost of the employer. So if you
True.
want to employ a woman, you will have to have all these things ready to ensure the safety. No, I know that's a well-intentioned thing. It's for the safety. But again, when you think from the employer's perspective, is adding to his cost. So we had
Yeah.
discussions with some of the factory owners. So
Yeah.
what the perspective that we got from them was, if you are putting too much regulations and too much conditions on the employer, this will have a negative effect. The law will
Okay.
have an unintended consequences of not employing women, even
True.
though the intention
Yeah.
is to bring in more women.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically,
So that is one
maybe
thing.
the policies have these intentions, but the incentives that are at play, that has not been given much attention to, I guess, because clearly the incentives of the owners, right? Just look at it, right? If you have to follow some of these provisions, then their compliance cost is going to increase, and which might lead to a situation that they will say, okay, I would prefer to have male employees as rather than female employees.
Exactly, yeah. So I was just trying to say that, as Sarthak said, the issue is there. Like the employer is having the same feeling, like what you said. He will always try to employ men over women because the compliance cost will be less when you compare the cost. That is one thing. Second, earlier the night shift problem was there, and in those factories which are working for like three shifts, especially
Yeah.
those chemical factories, we have refineries in Kochi, we have the rubber products and all those. So most of the heavy machinery,
Mhm.
they go for a three shift. So when night
Okay.
shift was not allowed, this three shift was a problem. So that's why they
How?
completely avoid women while hiring.
Why do you say
So
three shift was a
when
problem when night shift was not allowed?
because when there is a three shift, like
Uh-huh.
for a day, when there is a three shift, again
Mm-hmm.
they put it in a rotational basis. So
Okay.
anyway, men won't be liking to work in two shifts, so always getting the same shifts again and again. So that's why what they do is they don't employ women at all. They just employ women in the managerial and administrative department, which is hardly 20% of the total workforce,
Okay.
and eighty
Okay.
percentage of the workforce actually comes in the factory floor. So
Okay.
women couldn't even access those jobs. So when the code is actually trying, or the rules are actually trying to bring in more women to these segment, they should actually keep it at the minimum. The regulation should be minimum. The responsibilities over the employer also should be minimum.
Okay.
So otherwise,
When
opening
you
up all these sectors will not help.
Yeah, when you talk about consent, what is problematic about the consent provision that is there in the draft rules?
So the thing is, they have mentioned that consent should be taken from the employees in the beginning, right? Like if they are
Yeah.
going for employment, during appointment, any woman, just because of the fact that they would want to be employed, they'll be compelled to give that consent. That, in future, if they are going to be shifted into a night shift,
Mm-hmm.
they will have to, because that can be a criteria for the employer to not take them otherwise. There will be this natural tendency to have that bias towards men, considering that this consent provision is not required. So
For
many
men.
other obligations that are prescribed in the law are not required if you want to hire men to work in night shifts. So which is why consent is important. And another thing is, they haven't really mentioned specifically what form the consent should be in. So when we also went through other states laws relating to this, because every state had to bring out their own rules, right?
Mm-hmm.
And some states had a specific format for it. They had specific questions that should be mentioned in that consent form, whereas Kerala does not have that kind of a form. So we felt it's a little vague in that sense, that one is they haven't mentioned if there has to be a written consent or an oral one would do, and
Okay.
secondly, on what basis that like what criteria would be there if there is a written format, what should be mentioned in that form, and the like. So
Yeah, another limitation I could figure out was that, I mean, there are some provisions, if they're implemented, it will lead to duplication of efforts, right? You are basically creating parallel institutional mechanisms, or there will be multiple bodies having the same jurisdiction. For example, the POSH laws are there, and again, this law,
These rules.
yeah, these rules, right? They also try to have similar kind of provisions. So, anything else you found out here when it comes to duplication of efforts?
Yes, like what you said, we already have the sexual harassment provision, law in 2013. So they could have actually included that one particular provision saying that Sexual Harassment Act of 2013 may be complied. But what they
Yeah.
have done in Kerala rules is that they have brought in like about, I think, 7 to 8 provisions under the night shift provision, the main provision, saying that sexual harassment situation should be avoided. Basically, the idea is to avoid sexual harassment and the problems relating to that. But it's actually a duplication. That's one thing. Second, they're mentioning something called grievance day. So, especially for women, again, the provision is little ambiguous, saying that the provision is actually saying it has to be done in 1 month. Again, in there has to be one in 8 weeks. So there is a confusion there. Like what are they intending? Like whether it is one in 1 month or one in 8 weeks.
So
And
also
again,
the fact that you can't have a grievance day. You have to have a grievance mechanism, and that
exactly
grievance mechanism should work throughout. You can't have one
you can't
day.
wait for
I'm not
8 weeks.
Yeah, I'm not going to wait 8 weeks to lodge my complaint. I have to have a rolling or a continuous mechanism where I can approach anyone at any point in time if I have a grievance. Right? You can have SLAs for those grievance. The particular department can have a service level agreement saying that if you have lodged a grievance, it will be addressed in certain
Within
number of
duration.
days. Yeah, but
Exactly.
you can't say that you will have a grievance day once in 8 weeks or once a month. That disincentivizes or that dissuades women actually from raising grievance. I think that is, it may be a small provision, but I think that is kind of counterproductive to the whole effort of grievance redressal at all.
So yeah, I do agree with that. So it's also a duplication actually, because when we look at, see, we have to see the labor laws, the new labor codes as a whole. So in the Social Security Code, actually, they have a provision for this grievance redressal mechanism. So I'm just confused why they are introducing the same in the Occupational Safety Code as well. So that's actually a duplication of efforts.
And Suman, I'd like to come in between for the question you asked regarding why it's a grievance day and why there's a specific day for it. So as per the law, what they've written is actually on that particular day, a representative from the women's side can go and share the concerns with the employer. So from our study, what we understood is that mechanism will be there throughout. The employees can, go and inform their representative. It's just for that representative and the employer discussion or that particular thing, it's grievance day.
Okay.
But again, it's a duplication.
Yeah.
It's a duplication. And there are some more limitations. What we'll do is we'll take a quick break. And when we are back, we'll look at the other limitations, challenges, and we'll also try to find out what can be better solutions to this.
Sure, sir.
Welcome from the break. So before the break, we're discussing about some limitations. Another limitation, and which again often happens with policies, is the lack of clarity. Different terms are used in policies, different in the laws, and the interpretation of these terms can vary. And again, if the interpretation varies, the implementation will also get impacted, and it can lead to unintended consequences. It can lead to rent seeking. Multiple things can happen because of that. So in these rules, do you see any such thing where clarity is not there, there is ambiguity?
Yes, Sarthak. So there were various provisions we came across where we felt that the law is a little ambiguous. And so one such example would be, in case when the night shift ban is restricted, one of the conditions that the employer has to comply with is to provide sufficient women's security. Now, all the law says is sufficient women's security, and it's a little unclear as to what that term sufficient means. Whether it means more women's security guards or any other security systems like additional camera installations, or is it for checking the women employees that you need additional women security, or to safeguard them that we need more women security officers there. So that is one provision that is quite vague actually.
Another provision which is vague would be regarding the accommodation. So again, they say that the accommodation should be provided whenever required. again, it has got some vagueness there, because whenever
Yeah, what is
required, like
whenever?
how to determine this requirement.
Who
Who
determines it?
decides it? Yeah.
Yeah, who decides that? That is another issue. And coming to another provision again regarding this grievance day, as I mentioned earlier, they're not clear as to whether it has to be once in a month or once in 8 weeks, because
Yeah.
it's worded vaguely, it's ambiguous. And also, the most important thing is they mention a minimum requirement of women, like these many women should be there in the night shift for having this night shift for women. And the
Okay.
provisions say like this.
Basically, a minimum of 5 people should be employed in that particular shift, of which minimum 2 should be women.
But actually, they use in both the terms, they use female workers, like 2 female workers out of 5 female
In a batch
workers.
of 5.
Yeah.
Oh,
So again,
And,
there is no application of mind while drafting the law. That's what I feel. So again, we have pointed out all these things. What does this do? Whether they're intending there should be 2 out of every 5. It's like a proportion. So we were just confused about this. So if it is like a proportion, then if you have 100 employers for a night shift, 40 should be women. So
So you have to
which is like
ensure
a
that
very
only
high.
women are there working for night. Yeah, working
Yeah,
for
yeah,
night.
it's like a very high target that you're giving the employer. So otherwise, or are they intending just 2 women? Like minimum 2 should be there. Then I think the law could be better drafted saying that there should be minimum 2 women, rather than putting this 5 and all these confusions. So there are many provisions like this which are vague and which need more clarity for enforcement.
yeah. So while we have discussed the limitations here, what we'd like to, I mean, when we are in this kind of a setting, I think we need to come up with some solutions, what can be done better, right? So where do you think is there, more scope for improvement in the law itself, maybe, or in any of the actions that, any policy proposal that we can suggest?
As part of this study, we have actually brought out a policy brief which actually gives some suggestions as to how to improve the drafting of the law. I mean, at least we have suggested some of the provisions. So we have given submitted that to the government as well, and they have accepted most of the provisions that we have suggested in principle. So I hope some changes will come in the provisions to give more clarity. And also, one of the major drawbacks of the existing draft was that they were not aligning with the code, the central code, because women were not allowed to work in dangerous factories. Dangerous in the sense which is being classified as dangerous, those manufacturing activities. So this was there in the 1957 rules, and they actually followed that even in the new rules as well, in the 2021 rules as well. So we have pointed out this, that there is a lack of compliance with the central code, since they are just following the 1957 rules itself, that is not allowing women to work in these restricted activities. So we have suggested that only pregnant women should be restricted from these activities, and all other women should be allowed to work in every other sector if they would like to. So these are actually accepted in principle. So I am hoping that the changes will come. But personally, I feel that the legal, just removing the legal restrictions will not do the purpose, will not give the intention what they're looking for, because there are certain social and cultural problems that is also there. So I think we have to, at least the government have to try to give some incentives to the employers to hire more women, at least in the initial years, so they can think of some fiscal incentives or some tax incentives to start off. And also we need to have more awareness about the laws also. I think many of the women are not, even general public are not aware of the changes that is happening in such laws. So awareness has to be created. And another point would be
To add to what Anu mentioned regarding the activities, the ones that are considered as dangerous and restricted for women, there should be a better scientific, a more scientific basis for deciding what activities should be allowed or restricted for women. Because I can quote a few examples regarding the same. Like when we went for our field visit as part of our study, we found that certain activities, like in coir industry, women are restricted from using chemical dyes. They're restricted from doing that process of dyeing and stenciling of coir mats. So we went to a factory to see the process, how it's done. And we found that one is many of these processes have been mechanized. And secondly, the dyes that they are using now are less of chemicals and it's more water based dyes, which means the situation based on which this law was made earlier doesn't stand at this point.
Doesn't hold. Yeah.
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 So there are several other instances also that we came across where we felt there isn't a proper scientific basis. They have just carried forward all the restrictions that were there in the law that was 6 7 decades ago, and they've carried it forward as it is, and also added a few more restrictions. So that is definitely one area where we have a lot of scope for improvement and to make it a more women friendly one, something that offers better employment opportunities irrespective of gender.
Yeah.
Another key, okay, can I add one more point? So,
Yeah.
another observation that what we have made is that when we went to these factories, what we found is that most of the work that is done by women are unskilled work. Like in seafood processing industry, they are one of the, I mean, they are one major workforce, but they are into the peeling of the fish and all those things. In cashew industry, they do the, again, peeling of cashew nuts and all that. In coir industry also, they are into the unskilled one. So, and when you look deeper into the restricted activity, what I understand is that most of the restricted activities are better paid compared to the work that is done by women. So the restriction is actually creating a gender segregation of jobs, as well as it's creating a barrier for women to gain opportunities which reward her better. So I think these laws has to go. They have to be given equal opportunities irrespective of gender.
Do you have a
So when
question?
we're talking about complementary actions itself, right? One small thing that I noticed, or at least I thought, was that you're mandating for women supervisors, right? So while I mean that itself is a very onerous task for the employers, what can be done instead is small interventions such as, say, gender sensitization programs for male supervisors. I mean, this is a problem that lies across. It's not just a women's problem, it is everybody's problem. So how are we getting men to be more sensitive to this problem, or men to be more engaged with creating safe working spaces, right? So we have to involve the men into this whole process of creating safe workspaces. So one thing that we can definitely do is create training programs to help men supervisors deal or help them create a safe working environment for everyone. So those kind of interventions may be small, but I
Can be
think
effective in the
but
long
they are effective in the long run. They could be effective in the long run if they're designed well, if they're implemented well, etc. So I mean, while we can't mandate that these training programs, we can't mandate it in the law, but I think, as like you said, it is not just a legal problem, it has social, it has other facets to it, right? So this is one other facet I thought is a complementary action that can be done to just make spaces safer for women and therefore encourage women to be more in the workspace.
Yeah, I totally agree with your point. Gender sensitization programs should be there. Again, as you said, none of this should be a mandate that comes under the regulation, because over regulation would always lead to some unintended consequences which might affect the good intention of the law. So I think
Yeah.
it has to be in the negotiating space between the employer and employee.
Since you're
that
talking
that
about
space
the
should be given
mandate,
more importance, especially when it comes to these things like upskilling, like gender sensitization programs. Anyway, see, the employer will always would like to have better productivity. So even in some of our conversations with the factory employers, what we understood was that bringing in more women is actually improving their productivity, a better working environment because of the gender balance. So, gender sensitization programs are initiated by some of the factories as well. So, that's a good thing in the good initiative from their side.
yeah. So since you're mentioning about mandate, unintended consequences, so I just want to summarize the entire thing. So policy design should necessarily take into consideration the incentives of different actors, or else again will have different kinds of unintended consequences which you have to deal with. Apart from that, what we also observe is, I mean, when it comes to policy design, you have to take into consideration the state capacity. And as you were mentioning that some of these laws, they are leading to over regulation, or they have lot of things which the factory owners have to comply with, right? All these things creates opportunity for rent seeking, and especially when you do not have enough state capacity, things will be worse, right? So That also needs to be taken into consideration. Also, policy needs to be, whatever provisions are there within the policy, they should have clarity. If there is lack of clarity, again, it can create avenues for rent seeking. And lastly, we should try to avoid jurisdictional overlap. We do not have enough manpower to handle all these things, and on top of that, you are now giving them multiple things, and it also leads to a situation where you cannot fix accountability. So these are few things with which I think we can wrap up this discussion. Anu, April, do you want to add something?
Your final
Thoughts, final comments?
Sarthak, I totally agree to your concluding remarks. Everywhere, in every policy, the policy design, if the policy design itself is a problem, the whole implementation and everything will be affected. So we have to be very keen and very careful while drafting laws. That is one thing. Second, as you said, the state capacity is not that good, as we know. So especially when it comes to this laws, there was a provision of transportation. So transportation, again, the public transport is not that good. That's a whole reason behind why the employers had to provide the transport due to the problems in the public transport system. So what we have thought is that don't give the complete responsibility on the employer. Maybe he can also shoulder his responsibilities with other employers. So these are some of the recommendations that we have given to ease that situation, because transportation is something which has to be given. So state capacity.
Transportation is a law and order issue which has to be handled by the state itself. They're just shifting it to the employers.
Yes. So in this present situation, so what we have suggested is transportation, at that provision, let it stay, but give them more options, like to pool the resources of different employers together, rather than just asking one person to bear all the cost. So we suggested some of those in the current ecosystem. So these are some of the concluding remarks which I would like to make. So I hope that the changes will happen in the new draft that will be notified soon. As the labor codes will be coming into force by next year. I hope the states understand the issue and give more importance to these provisions so that we can have a better gender balance in our workforce.
Yeah. Thanks, Anu. Thanks, April. And we hope to...
Can I add one more line?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, as I would just like to actually appreciate the fact that the new labor codes that have come out have actually tried to bring in a new ideological shift by, opening up the sector, by removing the night shift ban, although they've tried to bring these safety restrictions. So on one hand, they've actually tried to bring in more progressiveness, but also I feel the government, like especially when the state government is bringing out rules, they should bring out rules in a more refined manner so that there's more clarity, and it shouldn't act as a hindrance. Their idea of trying to provide safety to women should be to uplift them and encourage them to it should ultimately result in improving the labor force participation and not act as a source of hindrance. That would be my concluding remark.
Yeah, thanks. This is the right remark to conclude this. Thank you, Anu. Thank you, April. Thank you, Suman, for joining us.
Thank you, Sarthak, for having us on the show.
Thank you, Sarthak, and thank you, Suman, for that wonderful session.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.